A humble farmer gave $25 to a hungry boy. 25 years later, a millionaire knocked on his door. Green Hollow was the kind of place where life moved slowly, and the land was as stubborn as the people who lived there. The dry, cracked earth stretched as far as the eye could see, with only a few patches of green struggling to survive under the relentless sun. Robert had spent his whole life in this town, working the fields day in and day out. He wasn't a rich man by any means, but he took pride in what little he had: a modest house, a small patch of farmland, and a loving family. His wife, Susan, always had a smile ready, no matter how hard the day had been, and Anna, their only daughter, was the light of their lives, with her laughter ringing out like a song even on the hottest, most miserable day. Life wasn't easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. One particularly scorching afternoon, as Robert worked the field, he spotted something unusual in the distance. A boy no older than 12 or 13 was crouched under an old, half-dead tree at the edge of their property. Robert paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. The boy was trying to pick something, anything, from the barren branches. His clothes were tattered, and his face was dirty. Robert's heart sank. He walked over, slow and deliberate so as not to startle the kid. When he got closer, he could see how thin the boy was. His ribs were practically visible through his shirt. "You all right there, son?" Robert asked, his voice soft but carrying the weight of concern. The boy looked up, startled. His big brown eyes were filled with a mix of fear and hunger. He didn't speak. He just shook his head. "Come on now, let's get you inside and get you something to eat." For a moment, the boy hesitated, as if he didn't believe what he was hearing. But when Robert turned and started walking toward the house, the boy followed, his bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. Inside, Susan was kneading dough for bread when they came through the door. She didn't ask questions, just gave David a knowing look and set another plate at the table. She ladled out a bowl of soup for the boy, who ate like he hadn't seen food in days. Robert watched his heart heavy, wondering where the boy had come from and how he had ended up in such a state. When the boy had finished, Robert leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "What's your name, son?" "David," the boy muttered between bites of bread. "And where are your folks, David?" David lowered his head. "Don't got none." Robert and Susan exchanged a glance, and Robert's heart ached for the boy. No child should have to fend for themselves like that. Robert stood up and reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled wad of bills. $25, the only money he had saved up to buy seeds for the next planting season. He placed it on the table in front of David. "Take this," Robert said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not much, but it'll get you on your way. You can use it to get to town, maybe find a place to stay, someone who can help you." David stared at the money, his eyes wide. He didn't reach for it. "I can't take that," he whispered. Robert shook his head. "You can, and you will. It's what you need right now. Just promise me you'll do something good with it." The boy's lip quivered as he took the money. His hands. He looked up at Robert, tears welling in his eyes. "I promise, sir. I'll pay you back someday. I'll come back, and I'll repay you for this." Robert smiled softly, patting the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry about paying me back, David. Just take care of yourself." He didn't say much as he left, just a quiet "thank you" before walking out the door and disappearing down the dirt road. Robert watched him go, feeling a strange mix of hope and sorrow. He had done what he could, but the world was a hard place for a kid like David. Still, there was something in the boy's eyes, something that told Robert that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right for him. That night, as Robert and Susan sat by the fire, looked over at him, her expression soft. "Do you think we'll ever see that boy again?" Robert shrugged, staring into the flame. "Maybe, but even if we don't, I reckon we did the right thing. The world needs more kindness, Susan, And if that boy is going to make it, he will need all the kindness he can get. Susan smiled, resting her head on Robert's shoulder. You are a good man, Robert. The world could use more people like you. Robert did not say anything. He just held her close, the warmth of the fire washing over them as the cool night air settled in. The land might be tough, the times might be harder, but tonight, for just a moment, they had hope. The days in Green Hollow passed, as they always had. Slow and steady, marked by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Life for Robert and his family went on, with the memory of David slowly fading into the background. Yet the boy's quiet, thank you, and his promise to return someday lingered in Robert's mind. He did not expect much from it. Life had taught him not to. But there was something about the sincerity in David's voice that stuck with him. Weeks turned into months, and the months into years. Robert continued his daily routine, working the fields from dawn till dusk, always trying to make the most out of what little the land provided. The money he had given David, though missed, did not feel like a loss. It was as if he had planted something deeper, a seed of hope that one day might bear fruit. Not that Robert ever expected to see David again. He did not even know where the boy had gone. But deep down he held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, David was out there somewhere, making something of himself. Susan, as usual, kept the house running. She never complained, though Robert knew things were hard for her. The work never stopped, and with their daughter Anna growing older, there were new concerns to think about. School fees, supplies. But, like Robert, Susan did not speak much of these troubles. They were a part of life, and they faced them with the quiet strength that defined so many in Green Hollow. Anna, though, was the bright spot in their lives, even on the most difficult days. Her laughter filled the small house, bringing warmth and light. She had inherited her mother's smile and her father's quiet determination. From a young age, she had taken to helping on the farm, doing what she could to lighten the load. But as she grew older, it became clear that Anna had bigger dreams than the farm could hold. I want to be a teacher, she told Robert one evening, her eyes shining with excitement. I want to help kids just like you, helped David. Robert smiled at that, his heart swelling with pride. He knew they did not have the money to send Anna to college, but the way she talked about it made it hard for him to dampen her spirit. Instead, he encouraged her dreams, telling her to work hard and stay focused. Maybe, he thought, things will fall into place somehow. It was not long after Anna's declaration that her health started to decline. At first, it was just little things, fatigue, the occasional cough, but it did not take long for the symptoms to worsen. The doctors in town could not figure out exactly what was wrong, but they all agreed on one thing. Anna needed treatment, and it was not going to be cheap. Robert and Susan were devastated. Their world, already fragile, seemed to be crumbling around them. The little savings they had would not be enough to cover the costs, and without the money, Anna's future, their future, looked bleak. For the first time in years, Robert found himself feeling truly powerless. One evening, as they sat around the table, the weight of the situation bearing down on them, Anna looked up at her father. We will figure it out, Dad. We always do. Robert smiled at her, but the sadness in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. I am not so sure this time, Anna, but we will keep trying. The truth was, Robert did not know what to do. He had always been able to provide for his family, even if it meant going without himself. But this felt different. He had no idea where to turn or how to make things right. One day, as Robert was working in the field, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. He paused, squinting against the sun as the shape of a large vehicle came into view. It was unusual for anyone to drive out this way. Most of the folks in Green Hollow did not even have cars that fancy. As the vehicle grew closer, Robert could see It was a sleek black sport utility vehicle, the kind of car that only someone with money would own. His heart began to race as the car slowed to a stop in front of the house. A man stepped out, dressed sharply in a suit, his shoes glinting in the sunlight. Robert stood still, unsure of what to think as the man approached. Something about him seemed familiar. The way he moved, the look in his eyes. "Robert," the man called out, his voice clear and confident. Robert furrowed his brow. "That's me," the man smiled. And in that moment, Robert saw it. The boy he had helped all those years ago. It was David, now a grown man standing before him, dressed in the finest clothes Robert had ever seen. David nodded, his smile widening. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Robert was speechless. He had always wondered what had happened to the boy, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this. David, no longer the skinny, hungry kid who had wandered onto his farm, was now standing before him as a man of wealth and success. David stepped forward, extending his hand. "I made a promise to you all those years ago, and I intend to keep it." Robert shook his hand, still in shock. "What do you mean?" David's eyes softened, and with a sincerity that brought back memories of their first encounter, he said, "You saved my life that day, Mr. Robert. Now, it's my turn to help you." Robert stood there, his mind racing as he took in the sight of David. No longer the frail, starving boy he had once helped, but now a confident, successful man. Time had done more than just change their lives. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with memories of a kind gesture, of a promise made under the scorching sun, and of years spent wondering what had happened to the boy who disappeared down the dirt road. "I can't believe it's really you," Robert finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. David chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to ease the tension in the air. "I never forgot what you did for me, Mr. Robert. Not for 1 second. I owe you everything." Robert waved his hand dismissively, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything, son. I did what anyone would have done." David's expression turned serious, his eyes locking onto Robert's. "No, not everyone would have done that. You and your family saved me when I had nothing. I was just a scared kid with no one to turn to, and you gave me a chance. I've never forgotten that." Robert's thoughts drifted back to that day. How David seemed so lost, so helpless. It had been an act of pure instinct to help him, something he didn't think twice about. But now, standing in front of this man who had turned his life around, Robert began to realize just how significant that moment had been. "Let's sit," David said, gesturing toward the front porch. "I want to tell you everything." They made their way to the old wooden chairs on the porch, the same ones that had been there for years. David glanced around, taking in the surroundings with a nostalgic smile. The house hadn't changed much, except for the wear and tear that time had inflicted on it. Robert sat down heavily, his mind still struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. "You look good, David," he said, his voice a mix of pride and surprise. "Seems like life's treated you well." David nodded, leaning back in the chair. "I've been blessed, Mr. Robert, more than I could have ever imagined." He paused, looking out at the field. "Those $25 you gave me, they were everything. I used that money to buy a bus ticket to the city. I didn't have much of a plan, but I knew I had to get out of here if I was ever going to make something of myself." Listened intently, David recounted the story of his life. After leaving Green Hollow, he had arrived in the city with nothing but the clothes on his back and the determination to make a better life. At first, things had been tough, sleeping in shelters, doing odd jobs just to get by, but slowly, David had worked his way up. He had found mentors along the way, people who believed in him and helped him get an education. Eventually, he had built a successful business from the ground up. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the start I needed. I've spent the last 25 years working, trying to make something of myself. And every day I thought about you and your family." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had always wondered what had become of David, but he had never expected something like this. "I'm proud of you, David," Robert said softly. "You've done well," David smiled, but there was a sadness behind his eyes. "I know things haven't been easy for you either, Mr. Robert. I want to repay the kindness you showed me." Robert opened his mouth to protest, but David held up his hand. "I know you're proud, and I respect that, but this isn't charity. This is me keeping my promise. I want to help." Before Robert could respond, the front door creaked open, and Susan stepped out onto the porch, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw David. "Is that David?" Robert said, standing up and gesturing toward their visitor. "You remember David, don't you?" Susan's face lit up with recognition, and she hurried over, pulling David into a tight embrace. "Oh my goodness, look at you, all grown up and successful." She stepped back, taking a good look at him. "We've wondered about you for so long." David grinned, clearly touched by the warm reception. "It's good to see you, Mrs. Susan. I've thought about you and Mr. Robert every day." They all sat down, and David continued to tell his story. Robert and Susan listened, captivated by the journey this young boy had taken and the man he had become. It was a story of resilience, but also of gratitude. And through it all, David made one thing clear. He had never forgotten the kindness shown to him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the conversation turned to the present. David's gaze shifted to Robert, his expression turning serious once more. "I know times have been tough for you," David said, his voice gentle. "I heard about Anna, about her illness." Anna was always at the forefront of his mind, her declining health casting a shadow over every aspect of their lives. "She's not well," he admitted quietly. "We have been trying to get her the help she needs, but we do not have the money." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "That is why I am here. I want to help. Whatever it takes to get her the treatment she needs, I will cover it. Doctors, hospitals, whatever. I will make sure she gets the best care." Robert stared at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. It was too much. He had never expected this, never thought that the boy he had helped so long ago would come back and offer something so incredible. "I cannot let you do that," Robert said, shaking his head. "It is too much." David leaned forward, his eyes filled with determination. "Mr. Robert, you saved my life. Now let me help save hers." The quiet evening air settled around the house as David's words lingered in Robert's mind. The offer to help Anna to provide the care she so desperately needed felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But there was still that nagging voice in Robert's head, the one that told him he could not accept so much from anyone, not even from someone like David. He had spent his whole life working, providing for his family, and relying on others had never been part of the plan. Robert leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "David, I do not know what to say. This is more than I ever expected." David smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I did not come back to expect anything from you, Mr. Robert. I came back because you gave me a chance when I had nothing. You helped me when no one else would. Now it is my turn to do the same." Robert shifted uncomfortably, his pride and gratitude battling inside him. He glanced at Susan, who sat quietly beside him, her hands resting in her lap. She was watching him closely, her expression soft but knowing. She had always been the more pragmatic of the two, and she could see the opportunity that David's return represented. Susan reached over and placed her hand gently on Robert's arm. "Robert," she said softly, "maybe this is what we need. Maybe it is okay to let someone else help. Just this once." Robert looked at her, his heart heavy. He knew she was right, but it was still hard to swallow. Accepting help was not something he was used to. But then he thought of Anna, her pale face, her tired eyes, the way she tried so hard to stay strong for them. If he did not do something soon, it might be too late. David seemed to sense the struggle going on in Robert's mind. "I know it is not easy to accept help," he said, his voice low and understanding. "But this is not just about you or me. It is about Anna. She deserves a chance, and if I can give her that, then I want to. Please, Mr. Robert, let me do this." Chess. When he opened them, he met David's gaze, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. "All right," Robert said quietly. "If it means Anna gets the help she needs, then, yes, we will accept your offer." A wave of relief washed over David's face, and he nodded, clearly pleased with Robert's decision. "Thank you, Mr. Robert. I promise you, we will get her the best care. I have already spoken to some doctors in the city, top specialists." Squeezed Robert's arm reassuringly. "We are grateful, David," she said softly. "More than you know." David smiled, the tension easing from his shoulder. "You do not have to thank me. I am just doing what I've always wanted to do, paying back the kindness you showed me." As the conversation shifted to the details of Anna's treatment, Robert couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, real hope, that Anna might have a chance. The burden that had weighed so heavily on his shoulders for months seemed to lighten just a little. Just maybe things would turn out all right. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Robert sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. He stared out the window, watching the sun rise slowly over the field. The quiet moments of the morning had always been his favorite. The world still and calm before the day's work began, but today felt different. There was a nervous energy buzzing inside him, a mix of anticipation and worry. Susan walked into the kitchen, her footsteps light as she approached him. "You're up early," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I couldn't sleep," Robert admitted. "Got a lot on my mind." Susan nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting beside him. "It's going to be all right, you know. David's going to help. We're not alone in this anymore." Robert took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. "I know. It's just, I still can't believe it. After all these years, he came back. And not just to say, thank you. He's really going to help Anna. It's more than I ever expected." Susan smiled softly. "Sometimes life surprises you. You did a good thing all those years ago, Robert, and now it's coming back to us in ways we never imagined." Robert nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. Helped David because it was the right thing to do. And now, all these years later, that kindness was being returned tenfold. Later that day, David returned with a plan in place. He had already arranged for a specialist to see Anna at a hospital in the city. All the arrangements were made. Transportation, medical bills, everything. Robert and Susan were amazed at how quickly things had moved, and they couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by David's generosity. "I'll take care of everything," David assured them. "You just focus on getting Anna ready. We'll leave tomorrow." Robert and Susan exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with a mix of hope and anxiety. The thought of leaving Green Hollow even for a short time was daunting, but it was for Anna's sake. They had to be strong for her. As the day drew to a close, Anna, unaware of the full extent of David's plans, sat by the window, gazing out at the fields. Her illness had taken so much from her. Her energy, her spirit. She had always been resilient, and he prayed that she would have the strength to fight this battle. Robert walked over to her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get you some help, Anna. The best doctors there are." David's making sure of it. Anna looked up at him, her eyes tired, with a quiet but determined sense of urgency. David had arranged for a car to take Robert, Susan, and Anna to the city for Anna's treatment. And as the sun rose over the fields of Green Hollow, they all knew that this day marked the beginning of something new. For the trip, careful to bring only what was necessary. Anna, though weak, moved around the house slowly, trying to help where she could. "You don't need to worry about anything," Susan said gently, guiding Anna back to her chair. "We'll take care of it all. You just need to rest." Anna smiled, though it was a tired one. She was grateful for the help, but she hated feeling like a burden. Some ways, her hope. But there was a light at the end of this dark tunnel, and that light was David. His return and the offer to help had given her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. David arrived just as they were finishing up, his usual confident and calm demeanor putting them all at ease. He carried with him an air of reassurance that everything was going to be all right. He greeted Robert and Susan with a warm smile and turned to Anna with a look of genuine concern. "Ready for this?" David asked, his voice soft but encouraging. Anna nodded, her gaze meeting his. "As ready as I will ever be." The drive to the city was quiet, with the hum of the car's engine filling the silence. Robert sat in the front passenger seat, staring out at the passing fields, his mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. He still couldn't quite believe this was all happening just days ago. He had been preparing himself for the worst, thinking there was no way out of the dire situation Anna was in. And now, thanks to David, there was a real chance she might get better. Susan sat in the back with Anna, silent gesture of comfort. She was hopeful, but like Robert, there was a small part of her that feared disappointment. They had been through so much, and she didn't want to let herself believe in something, only to have it taken away. But as she looked at David, sitting confidently behind the wheel, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to turn in their favor. The city loomed ahead of them, tall buildings and busy streets, a stark contrast to the quiet rural life they had always known. Green Hollow in years, and the energy of the city was both exhilarating and intimidating. But David seemed completely at ease, navigating the traffic with a practiced hand. "We're almost there. The doctors again this morning. They're ready for us." Anna felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. This was it. She was about to walk into a world she didn't understand, a world of tests and treatments, doctors and specialists. Believe that this was the beginning of her recovery. When they arrived at the hospital, David parked the car and helped Anna out, his hand steady as he guided her through the entrance. The hospital was enormous, filled with people bustling about, and the sterile smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Anna's legs felt shaky beneath her, but David was right there by her side, his presence calming her nerves. They were greeted by a team of doctors and nurses, all of whom seemed to know David well. He had made sure that everything was in place, and the efficiency with which they were brought in and settled was remarkable. Anna was taken for some initial tests, and while she was gone, Robert and Susan sat in the waiting room with David. "This is more than we could have ever hoped for," Susan said quietly, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know how we'll ever thank you, David." His head, "There's nothing to thank me for. This is the least I could do. You helped me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." Robert, who had been quiet for most of the day, finally spoke. "It's just hard to believe," he admitted. "We've been through so much. For the longest time, I thought there wasn't any hope left for Anna." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's something you taught me a long time ago. You gave me hope when I didn't have any, and now it's my turn to pass that on." Robert met David's gaze, and in that moment he understood. It wasn't just about the money or the treatment. It was about something deeper. David wasn't here out of obligation. He was here because he genuinely cared, because the kindness that Robert had shown him all those years ago had created a bond between them that went beyond mere gratitude. Hours passed as Anna underwent her tests, Susan sat in intense silence, their hands tightly clasped together. David, too, was quiet, though his calm exterior never wavered. It was clear that he was just as invested in Anna's recovery as they were. Finally, a doctor emerged from the back, his expression neutral as he approached them. Stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "How is she, Doc?" The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "She's stable. We've completed the initial tests, and while we'll need to run a few more, I'm optimistic. We're going to start treatment right away." Susan let out a breath. She didn't realize she was holding, and Robert felt the tension in his body ease ever so slightly. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. With emotion, "Thank you for everything." The doctor nodded. "We're going to do everything we can for her. She's in good hands." As they settled back into the waiting room, David turned to Robert and Susan. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "But we're in this together. Whatever happens, I'll be here." Robert looked at David, his heart full of gratitude. It was hard to put into words how much this meant to him, to know that they weren't alone in this fight. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt real. The days that followed were a whirlwind of doctors' tests and treatments. Anna remained in the hospital, her body slowly responding to the care she was receiving. Each day, Robert, Susan, and David would visit her, sitting by her bedside, offering comfort and encouragement. It was a long road, but the glimmers of improvement were there, small signs that Anna was beginning to regain some of her strength. Anna, though exhausted, found herself feeling more hopeful than she had in months. From David gave her the courage to keep fighting. She would often catch David watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration, and though she hadn't quite figured out what to make of it, she appreciated his constant presence. "I'm feeling a little better today," Anna would say on the days when her energy allowed her to speak more than a few words at a time. "That's good," Robert would reply, his face lighting up at the sound of her voice. "You just keep resting. We're all here with you." Susan would nod in agreement, squeezing Anna's hand while David sat quietly. As the days turned into weeks, Anna's condition continued to improve, though it was a slow and steady process. She began to regain some color in her cheeks, and her strength started to return little by little. The doctors were optimistic, made it clear that the road to full recovery would be long and uncertain. During this time, David became more than just a benefactor. He was there for every step of Anna's journey, sitting with her through the long hours of treatment, holding her hand when the pain became too much, and offering up words of encouragement when she felt like giving up. One afternoon, as Anna rested in her hospital bed, David sat by her side, flipping through a book he had brought her. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines that monitored Anna's vitals. Her head slightly to look at David. "You don't have to stay here all the time, you know," she said softly, her voice still weak but gaining strength. David glanced up from the book, his eyes meeting hers. "I want to be here," he said simply. "You don't have to go through this alone." Faintly touched by his sincerity, she had never known someone like David, someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being without expecting anything in return. It was a strange feeling, but a comforting one. "You've done so much for me already. Know how I'll ever repay you." David shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Anna. I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing it because I want to. You're important to me." Anna's smile faded slightly as she processed his words. There was something in the way he said it, the way he looked at her, that made her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure if it was the medicine or her own emotions, but there was a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know what to say," his gaze steady and calm. Just focus on getting better. That's all I want. Anna closed her eyes, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But before she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but think about David, about his kindness, his unwavering support, and the way he made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. As Anna's condition continued to improve, so did the bond between her and David. What had started as a simple act of gratitude on David's part was slowly turning into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. David found himself drawn to Anna in ways that went beyond his initial desire to repay the kindness her family had shown him. There was a connection between them, one that grew stronger with each passing day. For Robert and Susan, it was a relief to see Anna recovering. Her health had been their biggest worry for so long, and now, with the help of David and Miss Hay, doctors, there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel. But as they watched Anna and David together, they couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in their dynamic. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, hospital's small cafeteria, sipping on lukewarm coffee, the day had been a good one. Anna was showing signs of real improvement, and for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could breathe a little easier. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" Susan asked, breaking the silence, comfortable silence between them. Robert glanced at her, raising an eyebrow, and noticed what David and Anna said. Her tone was light, but knowing there was something going on between them. Anna smiled softly. "I've seen the way he looks at her. He cares about her, and I think she's starting to feel the same." Robert let out a long breath, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know, Anna. David's been nothing but good to us, but this is Anna. I just don't want her to get hurt." Susan reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "I don't think he would hurt her, Robert. David's a good man. He's been there for her every step of the way. Maybe this is something good, something we didn't see coming." Robert nodded slowly, though the protective father in him wasn't so easily convinced. He trusted David. He had no reason not to. But the thought of his daughter becoming attached to someone who had come into their lives under such unusual circumstances made him uneasy. Still, he couldn't deny that David had done more for their family than they could have ever hoped for. "Suppose we'll just have to see how it plays out," Robert said, his voice resigned but not without hope. Over the next few weeks, Anna's recovery continued. The treatments were working, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. Each day, she grew a little stronger, her spirit lifting as her health improved. And with that improvement came the slow, undeniable realization that her feelings for David were changing. What had once been gratitude was evolving into something more. She couldn't deny the growing connection between them, the way her heart seemed to skip a beat whenever he walked into the room, and as much as she tried to push those feelings aside, she found it harder and harder to ignore. One evening, as David sat by her bedside, reading aloud from a book, Anna found herself watching him, really watching him. His focus on the words, the way his voice softened with each turn of the page, the way he seemed to be completely at ease in her presence. There was something about him that made her feel safe, cared for in a way she hadn't expected. And in that moment, Anna knew. As the days turned into weeks, Anna found herself grappling with feelings she had never anticipated. Her recovery was slow but steady, and every day brought a small victory, a little more strength in her legs, a little less pain in her chest. But with each step forward in her physical health, she also found herself moving closer to an emotional realization that left her both excited and uncertain. She had come to depend on David, not just for the financial and emotional support he had provided, but for something deeper, something that had taken root in her heart without her even knowing. It was as if the kindness he had shown her had become a bridge to something more, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope, and even the beginnings of love. David had been with her through it all, through the darkest days of her illness, through the sleepless nights when pain and fear had kept her awake, and through the small quiet moments when all she needed was someone to sit with her in silence. He had been her rock, and now, as she began to regain her strength, Anna couldn't deny that her feelings for him had evolved into something more than just gratitude. Sunlight filtered through the trees outside. David arrived with his usual warm smile. He carried a small bouquet of flowers, which he placed on the table next to her bed. "You didn't have to bring those," Anna said, though her heart warmed at the gesture. "I wanted to," David replied, his smile soft but genuine. "How are you feeling today?" Anna looked up at him, the sunlight catching her eyes better. She said honestly, "I feel stronger every day, thanks to you." David shook his head. "You're the one doing all the hard work. I'm just here to cheer you on." Anna smiled, her heart skipping a beat at the sincerity in his voice. There was something about the way he looked at her, the way his gaze seemed to linger just a little longer than necessary, that made her wonder if he felt it too. This connection, this bond that had formed between them. She wasn't sure when it had started, but she knew it was there, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. As the afternoon sunlight faded and the room grew dimmer, Anna found herself growing more contemplative. David sat by her bedside, reading aloud from the book they had started together. His voice was soothing, and she closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. But instead of listening to the story, her mind wandered to him, the way he had been there for her, how his presence had become such a comfort. "David," Anna said softly, interrupting his reading. He looked up from the book, a question in his eyes. "What is it?" Anna hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to say what was on her mind, but she couldn't hold back any longer. She needed to know if he felt the same, if this connection was real. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I've been thinking a lot lately about everything, about you." David closed the book, placing it gently on the table beside him. His full attention was on her now, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've done so much for me, more than I could ever ask for," Anna continued, her heart pounding in her chest. "And I've been trying to figure out how to thank you, how to repay you. But the truth is, I don't think it's just gratitude I'm feeling anymore." David's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, as if to encourage her to keep going. I think I'm starting to feel something more," Anna admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I didn't expect. I don't know what it means, or if I'm even ready to feel it, but it's there." Anna felt her heart race as she waited for David to respond, unsure of what he would say, or if she had just made a terrible mistake. David's gaze softened, and he reached out to take her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Anna," he began, his voice low and steady, "you have no idea how much you mean to me." Anna's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. "I have been trying to keep my feelings in check," David continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "because the last thing I wanted was to make things harder for you. But the truth is, or if it was the right time." Anna's heart swelled with emotion, a mix of relief and joy washing over her. She had not been imagining it. The connection between them was real, and David felt it just as strongly as she did. "I care about you, Anna," David said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "More than I ever thought possible, and I do not want to rush anything. But I want you to know that whatever you are feeling, I am right there with you." Anna felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of relief that flooded through her heart. She had been so afraid to admit her feelings, so unsure of what would happen if she did. But now, Hearing David say those words, she realized that she did not have to be afraid anymore. "I do not know what comes next," Anna said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I do know that I want you to be a part of it. We will figure it out together." They sat there in the fading light, their hands clasped together, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing moment. It was not just about the kindness or the gratitude anymore. It was something deeper, something that had taken root and blossomed into something beautiful. For the first time in a long while, Anna allowed herself to feel it, herself to believe in the possibility of a future that was filled with more than just recovery. It was a future that included David, and the thought of that filled her heart with a sense of hope and happiness she hadn't felt in years. Anna had never been the type to wear her heart on her sleeve, but ever since her quiet confession to David, she felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. The weight of uncertainty, of not knowing where they stood, had been lifted. There was a clarity between them now, a shared understanding that had taken root during those long, quiet days in the hospital. But even with that weight lifted, there was still so much left unsaid. The next few days passed in a blur of treatments and small improvements. Anna was getting stronger, strong enough that the doctors began talking about her eventual release from the hospital. It was good news, and yet it brought with it a new set of worries. What would happen after she went home? How would things change between her and David now that their feelings were out in the open? One afternoon, as they sat in her hospital room, the conversation finally turned to the inevitable. "So," Anna said, her voice light but filled with underlying tension, "the doctors think I might be able to go home soon." David looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression brightening. "That's great news," Anna nodded, her hands fiddling with the blanket that covered her legs. "It is. I'm excited, of course, but I guess I'm also a little nervous." David frowned slightly, closing the book and setting it aside. "Nervous about what?" Anna hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "About what happens next. I mean, we've been here in this bubble for weeks now. Everything's been about my treatment, about getting better. But once I go home, things are going to change, aren't they?" David's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked at her. "Things don't have to change, Anna, not between us." Anna let out a small laugh, though there was little humor in it. "I know, but it's easy to say that now, when we're still here. What if things get complicated?" "Things are already complicated," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean we can't figure it out. I'm not going anywhere, Anna, no matter what happens." Anna met his gaze, her heart swelling at his word. She wanted to believe him, and deep down, she knew he meant it. But there was still that small nagging doubt in the back of her mind, the fear that once they left the safety of the hospital, everything would feel different. "I just don't want to lose what we have," she whispered. "You won't," David assured her. "We'll take it one day at a time. You're not in this alone, Anna. I'm here for whatever comes next." David's presence and his unwavering support had been a constant throughout her recovery, and now, knowing that he was committed to staying by her side, she felt a weight lift from her chest. A few days later, Anna was finally discharged from the hospital. It was a bittersweet moment. She was grateful to be going home, but there was a part of her that would miss the routine of the hospital, the safety net that had been there during her most vulnerable day. But she wasn't going home alone. David had insisted on driving her, making sure she was comfortable, and cared for every step of the way. As they drove down the long winding road that led out of the city and back toward Green Hollow, Anna found herself staring out the window, watching the landscape shift from tall buildings and crowded streets to open fields. It was strange, being back in the world after so many weeks, confined to a hospital bed. The air felt fresher, the sun warmer, but there was also a sense of uncertainty that hung over her. What are you thinking about?" Anna turned to look at him, her lips curving into a small smile. "I don't know, just everything, I guess." David nodded, understanding. "It's a big change after everything you've been through, but you're stronger now. You've come a long way." Anna smiled, appreciating his words, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what came next, not just for her, but for them. When they arrived at the farm, Robert and Susan were waiting on the porch, their faces lighting up with joy at the sight of Anna. They rushed down the steps to greet her, pulling her into a warm embrace. Robert's eyes were misty as he hugged his daughter, and Susan's smile was wider than Anna had seen in months. "You're home," Susan said softly, brushing a strand of Anna's hair behind her ear. "You're finally home." Anna nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It felt good to be home, to be surrounded by the familiar sights and smells. But as she glanced over at David, who was standing a few feet away, watching the reunion with a small smile, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved between them. That evening, after Robert and Susan had gone to bed, Anna found herself sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark fields. The air was cool, and the stars twinkled above her, casting a soft glow over the landscape. She heard the creak of the porch door behind her and turned to see David, stepping outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Anna shook her head, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "Not at all." David sat down next to her, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the stars. Anna could feel the tension building inside her, the unspoken words she had been carrying since they left the hospital bubbling up to the surface. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet in the stillness of the night. "What about us?" Anna took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I meant what I said before in the hospital about how I feel, but now that I'm home, I just want to be sure we're on the same page." David reached over, taking her hand in his. "Anna, I have been sure about this for a long time. I care about you more than I have ever cared about anyone, and I do not want to rush anything, but I also do not want to pretend like what we have is not real." Anna's heart swelled at his words, a sense of relief washing over her. She had been so afraid of what might happen when they left the hospital, but now, sitting here under the stars with David, she realized that her fears had been unfounded. "I do not want to pretend either," she whispered. David smiled, his hand squeezing hers gently. "Then, we do not have to. We will take things as they come, together." And in that moment, under the vast night sky, Anna felt a sense of peace settle over her. She did not know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The day that followed, Anna's return to the farm, was filled with a sense of peace that she had not experienced in months. The weight of her illness had begun to lift, and each morning she woke up, feeling just a little bit stronger. Her body was healing slowly but surely, and with that healing came a newfound clarity about what she wanted for her future, both for herself and for her relationship with David. David had stayed in Green Hollow, renting a small place nearby so he could continue to be close to Anna and her family. He did not want to push her, and their time together had become a delicate balance between giving her space to recover and being there for her whenever she needed him. They spent their days walking around the farm, talking about life, their hopes, and even their fears. It felt like they were building something real, something that extended beyond the boundaries of gratitude or obligation. Anna, though still cautious, felt her heart opening more each day. There was a part of her that had been holding back, afraid that the connection they had built in the hospital would not translate to real life. But as the days turned into weeks, those fears began to fade. David had shown her time and again that he was here for the long haul. One evening, as they sat together under the stars once again, Anna found herself reflecting on how far she had come. It was strange to think that just a few months ago, she had been lying in a hospital bed, unsure if she would even survive. And now, here she was, not just surviving, but beginning to thrive. "I've been thinking," Anna said, her voice soft in the quiet of the night. David turned to look at her, his expression curious but patient. "About what?" "About everything," Anna replied, her eyes drifting toward the dark fields that stretched out before them. "About the farm, about my parents, about us." David's gaze softened, and he shifted slightly in his seat, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Anna took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I think for a long time I was afraid to imagine a future for myself. The illness took so much from me. And there were days when I didn't think I'd ever get better. But now I can finally start thinking about the future again, and I want you to be a part of it." David's expression remained calm, but Anna could see the flicker of emotion in his eyes. "I want that too, Anna," he said quietly. "I've wanted that for a while now." Anna smiled, feeling a surge of warmth in her chest. "It's just, everything feels so different now. I feel different, stronger, more hopeful, and I think a part of that is because of you." David's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers gently. "You've always been strong, Anna. You didn't need me to show you that, but I'm glad if I've been able to help." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that whatever it is, I want us to face it together." David wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. One step at a time over the next few weeks, as Anna continued to regain her strength, she and David became inseparable. They spent nearly every day together, their bond deepening with each shared moment, every laugh, and every quiet conversation. Robert and Susan had taken notice, and while Robert remained cautiously optimistic about the blossoming relationship, "You know, I think they're good for each other," Susan said one evening as she and Robert sat together on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. Robert, arms crossed over his chest, glanced over at her. "You think so?" "Anna's been through so much, and for a while there, I didn't think we'd ever see her smile again. But now look at her. She's happy, and I think David has a lot to do with that." Robert was silent for a moment, watching as David and Anna walked hand in hand across the field, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. He couldn't deny that his daughter seemed happier, healthier than she had in months. And David, Robert had to admit that the young man had proven himself time and again. He had been there for Anna in ways Robert couldn't, and for that, he was grateful. "I suppose you're right?" "He's been good to her," Susan smiled, patting his knee affectionately. "You'll see, Robert. This is a good thing for Anna." The days were filled with a newfound sense of purpose. Anna began helping out around the farm again, taking on small tasks that made her feel like she was contributing once more. Her body was still recovering, and there were days when fatigue crept up on her, but she didn't let it stop her. Each step forward felt like a victory, and she clung to that sense of progress with both hands. One afternoon, as she and David were walking through the fields, Anna suddenly stopped, turning to face him. "David," she began, her tone serious, "there's something I need to say." David stopped, his brow furrowing. Slowly, "What is it?" Anna took a deep breath. "I do not know if I have said this enough, but I am so grateful for everything you have done for me. You saved my life in more ways than one. And I do not just mean the hospital, or the doctors, or the treatments. You have been there for me every step of the way." And David gently placed his hand on her cheek, cutting her off with a tender look. "Anna, you do not have to thank me. I did what I did because I care about you, because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Anna felt like the world had stopped. She stared up at him, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, She allowed herself to truly feel what had been building inside her all this time. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. David's smile was soft, but there was a depth to his eyes that made Anna's heart swell. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and in that moment, under the vast open sky of Green Hollow, Anna knew that she had found something she had not even realized she was searching for. A future, something more. Carl. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, the world around them fading into the background. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, Anna felt like everything was going to be okay. The bond between Anna and David had grown stronger with each passing day, and now with their feelings for each other fully out in the open, life in Green Hollow had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Anna was recovering well, the farm was running smoothly, and the sense of hope and happiness that had once seemed so distant was now a constant presence in their lives. But there was one last bridge to cross. While Anna had accepted her feelings for David, and David had made it clear that he was committed to her and her family, Robert had yet to fully come to terms with the idea. He trusted David, but the thought of his daughter being in a relationship with someone who had come into their lives under such unusual circumstances still made him cautious. One evening, after a long day of working on the farm, Robert sat on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The familiar scent of earth and grass filled the air, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. It was a scene Robert had seen countless times before, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Anna, about how much she had been through, and how much she had changed since David had come back into their lives. Susan joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of coffee as she sat down beside him. "You are quiet tonight," she observed, her voice gentle. Robert took a sip of the coffee, nodding slightly. "Just thinking about Anna and David," Susan asked, her tone knowing. Robert let out a long sigh. "Yeah, I cannot help it, Susan. I know David has been good to us, better than we could have ever asked for, but it is still hard for me. I understand. You are her father, and you will always worry about her, but you have seen how happy she is. David has been there for her every step of the way, and he has proven that he cares about her. I think it is time we trust that." Robert stared out at the fields, his expression thoughtful. "I do trust him," he admitted. "It is just this whole thing still feels so unreal. All these years we struggled, and then David came back out of nowhere. It is like a dream, and I am still waiting to wake up." Susan chuckled softly. "Sometimes life surprises us, Robert. You taught me that, and maybe this is just one of those times when everything falls into place." Robert was silent for a moment. He knew she was right. Anna was happier than she had been in years, and David had shown time and again that his intentions were genuine, were pure, but as a father, daughter's heart. Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Robert found himself watching David and Anna interact. There was an ease between them that was impossible to ignore. The way they spoke to each other, the small, affectionate gestures they shared. It was clear that David's feelings for Anna went beyond simple gratitude, and it was equally clear that Anna felt the same. After dinner, as the plates were cleared and the evening began to wind down, Robert asked David to step outside with him. The two men stood on the porch, the cool night air surrounding them, the sounds of the farm settling into its nighttime. "David," Robert began, his voice calm but serious, "there's something I need to say." David turned to face him, his expression attentive. "What's on your mind?" Robert hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "I've watched you and Anna grow close over these past few months, and I can see how much you care about her. She means the world to me, And I just want to make sure that whatever this is between you two, that you're in it for the right reasons." David met Robert's gaze. "Mr. Robert, I understand your concerns, and I want you to know that my feelings for Anna aren't something I take lightly. I love her. I've loved her for a while now, and I want to build a future with her. This isn't about paying back a debt or anything like that. It's real." Robert nodded slowly, taking in David's words. There was something about the way David spoke. It was clear that this young man, the same boy he had once helped all those years ago, had grown into someone who was not only capable of caring for his daughter, but who truly wanted to be a part of their family. "I believe you," Robert said finally, his voice soft but firm, "and I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done. You've given Anna a second chance at life, and for that I'll always be thankful. But more than that, you've become part of our family." David's eyes softened, and he nodded, clearly moved by Robert's words. "Thank you, Mr. Robert. That means more to me than you know." Robert reached out and clasped David's shoulder, his grip firm. "Just take care of her. That's all I ask." "I will," David promised, his voice steady. "You have my word." With that, a sense of peace settled over Robert. He had spent so much time worrying about the future, about what would happen to Anna. But now, standing there with David, he realized that things had changed. Anna wasn't just his little girl anymore. She was a woman who had been through more than most, and she had found someone who truly cared for her. As they rejoined the family, the air between them lighter. Robert caught Anna's eye. She smiled at him, a knowing look in her gaze, and Robert felt his heart swell with pride. She was going to be all right. They all were. That night, as Robert lay in bed beside Susan, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in years. The farm was quiet, the night air cool against the open window, and for the first time in a long, he allowed himself to relax. His family was whole again, and for that, he was deeply, profoundly grateful. The following weeks felt like a dream, one where every moment was filled with warmth, love, and the quiet contentment of lives falling into place. The farm bustled with life again as Anna continued to regain her strength, and with David by her side, the once daunting challenges of the future now seemed manageable. Anna had taken on more responsibilities around the farm, and the work, which had once been a burden, now felt like a joy. Every morning, she would wake up with a sense of purpose, knowing that each day brought her closer to full recovery. Her health was steadily improving, and the doctors had assured her that with time and care, she would continue to get stronger. But it wasn't just her physical health that had changed her heart. The bond she shared with David had deepened in ways she hadn't thought possible. What had started as a simple act of gratitude had blossomed into something far more profound. It was love, real and undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, Anna felt like her future was filled with possibilities. One afternoon, as Anna and David worked together in the fields, planting seeds for the upcoming season, Anna paused to take in the sight around her. The fields stretched out in front of them, the sun shining down on the fresh earth. It was a scene of renewal, a revival of life beginning again after a long winter. As she looked over at David, who was focused on his work, she felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. "This feels good," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. David looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "It does," he agreed, his smile easy. "It's like everything's finally coming together," Anna nodded, her heart full. "There were times when I thought I'd never see these fields again. But now it feels like home." David stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "This is home," he said softly, "and you're exactly where you're meant to be." Anna smiled, reaching out to take his hand. They stood there for a moment, the wind gently rustling the leaves of the trees around them, the world quiet and peaceful. In that stillness, Anna felt the weight of the past months melt away, replaced by the joy of the present and the hope of the future. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Anna said, her voice thoughtful. "About how much has changed, about how far we've come." David squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "We've come a long way," he agreed, "and I wouldn't change any of it." Anna smiled at his words, but there was a seriousness in her expression as she continued. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, David. You saved my life." More than once, David shook his head gently, his thumb brushing across her hand. "You saved yourself, Anna. I just gave you the chance to fight." Anna's smile softened, and she felt a lump in her throat. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done for me, for my family." David looked at her, his expression tender but firm. "You don't need to repay me. You and your family gave me everything when I had nothing. This, all of this, it's just the cycle coming back around." It was true. What had started with her father's act of kindness all those years ago had come full circle. David had repaid that kindness in ways they could never have imagined. And now, standing here with him, Anna felt the full weight of that connection. "It's amazing how one small act can change everything," she said quietly. David nodded, his gaze drifting toward the fields. "It is. Your father gave me a second chance at life, and now we found something even more." She thought about her father, about the man who had given everything to help someone in need, never expecting anything in return. And now, because of that simple act of kindness, their lives had been forever changed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the family gathered around the dinner table, the conversation was light and filled with laughter. Robert and Susan sat at one end, their faces glowing with happiness as they watched their daughter, strong and healthy, smile and laugh alongside David. The joy in the room was palpable, and for Robert, it was a moment of deep pride. His family had been through so much: hardship, illness, fear, and yet here they were, together, stronger than ever. And David, well, Robert had come to think of David as part of the family now. The young man who had once been a stranger had become someone they couldn't imagine their lives without. As the meal came to an end, Robert cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I want to say something," he began, his voice a little rough but filled with emotion. "We've all been through a lot these past few months, and I know I don't say it often, but I'm proud of all of us, proud of this family." Susan smiled at him, her eyes soft with affection, and Anna's hand found David's under the table. Robert continued, his gaze settling on David. "David, you've been more than a friend to us." David, clearly moved by Robert's words, nodded, his voice quiet but steady as he replied, "Thank you, Mr. Robert. This place has been more of a home to me than anywhere I've ever been. I'm just glad I could be here for all of you. The room felt I could be here for all of you." Into a comfortable silence. After that, the weight of Robert's words hanging in the air like a quiet blessing. Anna glanced over at David, her heart full, and in that moment she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the night drew to a close, Anna found herself standing outside, looking up at the stars. David joined her, his hand slipping into hers as they stood in the cool night air. "You know," Anna said softly, "I think we're going to be okay." David smiled, his eyes reflecting the light of the stars above them. "Yeah, I think we are." And as they stood there under the vast expanse of the night sky, Anna felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The cycle of kindness that had started so many years ago had come full circle, and now, with David by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they had found something beautiful, something that would last.